Hey gang, welcome to this episode of the Ministry Show. I think we have a big treat for you today. I have my good friend Steve Caton from the Giving Crowd with us today. Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Always a pleasure to do something like this with you. And I'm going to try to keep it serious. You know, I know we like to have fun.
We'll
try to keep it serious,
That's a lie.
right?
So you shouldn't lie to our audience. Come on, man. But hey, the Giving Crowd is one of our sponsors, and there's lots of reasons why. But before we get into that, the Giving Crowd to me is a great name, but it could mean lots of different things potentially. Can you just tell us, what is it that you guys do?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Chris. You know, I think probably the umbrella to put this under would be to kind of see the stewardship conversation from a whole new perspective. The Giving Crowd is about increasing stewardship, but in a whole different manner than what we're accustomed to. Because when we think of stewardship in America, giving in America, we're almost always talking about people's checkbooks, people's cash flow, and giving out of that. And so the part of the conversation that gets left off of the table, especially in the local church, is this concept of giving out of our assets, which is actually 91% of what has been entrusted to us. An average American is usually entrusted with about 91% assets and then 9% cash. And when we talk about assets, I'll get into that a little bit more later. What do we mean by that? But we're really wanting to open up the asset side of the conversation because there's just so much more to work with there.
So for the folks that are listening in, and even for myself, you and I have talked a few times about this, why do you think that we focus so much on the current income giving in the church world versus the asset side of it?
Good question. I think a couple things come to mind for me there, Chris. Number one, when you think about all of the content that's been written on the stewardship conversation, think about Dave Ramsey, Randy Alcorn, Ron Blue, all those things. I mean, all of that was phenomenal content. And it's really going after the felt need that a lot of Americans have, which is, how do I get financially healthy? And financially healthy for most people looks like, I got to get out of debt. You know, I've got debt I need to pay off. I need to save money for the future because, as we know, in America, our country hasn't been very good at saving money. And then there's this concept of generosity and giving. And so I think because the felt need and the pain is most often associated with our cash flow, with our budget, that's where most of the emphasis is when it comes to both the generosity conversation as well as any content written on it. And so it just leaves this whole other piece kind of on the back burner.
As you've conversed with me, it's helped Kathy and me, my wife and I, just look at our whole financial picture and go, oh, I never thought about this piece of property or bank account or whatever as an asset, you know? So can you go through maybe some common assets that most of us have that we don't, I don't put it in the asset category. When I think assets or giving out assets, I think multi-gazillionaire business owner that has 43 cars and a barn and, a home in Hawaii and all this. So, but that's not really what you're talking about.
Well, that's one piece of what we're talking about.
Oh, it is. Okay,
But let's put that one aside for a second and let's talk about the one that's relevant to most people listening today. And that would be, for the average American, the assets we're referring to would be things like the equity that we have in our homes, our life insurance policies, our 401ks. For the middle American couple, those are the kind of assets that we're talking about. And it's not something like cell phones or vehicles either, right? Although those are assets. But what we're talking about through this lens of generosity is those things like our home equity, our life insurance policies, and our 401k, our retirement funds. So we're talking about that on one side of it. And then the other side would be what you brought up, Chris, which is the guy who God has entrusted with more than the average American, and they have a business that they own, that they started themselves, and that business is worth money. It's appreciated. Because of the success of the business, it's appreciated. It could be real estate. It could be a farm or a ranch. It could be a warehouse. There's all kinds of other things that fall into that category. But for the average American, it is those things I mentioned. And what's interesting about it, Chris, is that we don't typically think in those terms like, how can I leverage those things to make a kingdom impact, the conversation we want to open.
Wow. And so the Giving Crowd helps us average people, the business owners and all that you're talking about as well, to utilize the assets that we've been entrusted with in order for kingdom benefit but today, not just some kind of legacy thing.
Yeah, and again, it's a both and. It's a both and, right? So we want to help people learn how can they be more generous today, leveraging those things that God has entrusted to us, and how can we leave a legacy? So just personal experience, when Tara and I, my wife Tara and I, updated our will recently, and as we were going through it, I had a will from the past that hadn't been updated for many years, and the average American hasn't updated their will for 70% of Americans don't even have a current will. I was in that category until about a year ago. And so when we were updating the will, one of the questions we asked ourselves was, hey, well, if something happens to both of us at the same time, what would we want to happen with all of the money that would come out of the life insurance policy and the home equity? We had this conversation about, well, let's make sure that at a minimum we tithe out of that and we give 10% at least to the charities that we're already supporting. When we looked at that number, we were like, oh my gosh, we had no idea, because we don't see ourselves as wealthy, We're just middle American people like most of us. But when we saw that number, it was like, man, that is a significant amount of impact that we can make for our church and for the other charities that we support.
Yeah, very good. Can I talk intimidation factor just for a second? Because someone with lots of assets may be intimidating to us to maybe visit with about this concept of generosity. There seems to be I don't know a better way to ask it than just that intimidation factor. How do you help us bridge that?
Are you talking about intimidation from the standpoint of somebody on church staff?
Yeah, or a finance committee at a church. Yeah. And we have these needs as a church. They're real needs, and we can make a difference. And we think we know that so-and-so could maybe do something about that, but how do I bring that up? Or, walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, because it is a bit intimidating to have that conversation. There's a couple of pieces that become obstacles. One would be, how do I approach that conversation without it feeling kind of just off? It feels like, oh, wait a minute. Why is somebody on the church staff or the finance committee wanting to talk to me about my balance sheet? And so there's that piece of it. And then the second piece of it is just the sophistication that goes with having a conversation about somebody's assets. It's just a different level of awareness and expertise and understanding that often you don't find in a local church. So
let's face it, we don't bring this up every day.
Right.
It's not something that's on my weekly agenda. This would be kind of a new thing. So
yeah, absolutely. So this is actually one of the key value pieces that we bring to the table for a church. So when we are working alongside of a church, we get to be the one, someone from the giving crowd gets to be the one that has the conversation with the individual in the congregation who has been entrusted with these assets. So we use relationship in order to bridge to those individuals, and then we sit down with them and have the dialogue. So we're a safe third party that's not a part of the church staff, but the church is providing us to the people in their congregation as a method of serving them. It's a new way to serve people who honestly aren't being served. And here's the thing that's really interesting is we assume that people of means have got all these really smart people in their life giving them advice about this stuff, and that's just not true. They're not getting advice on how do I be a more effective steward of what God has entrusted to me and take these things that he has given me and release that for kingdom purposes. Because financial advisors and attorneys and CPAs, while they are well-meaning and providing a great function, they're typically in a mode of preservation of those assets, not how do I help my client give those assets away. So we become, number one, a new voice in that person's life that isn't there currently. So we're serving them in a way that no one else is. And we're a safe third party. They can open up their balance sheet and have that conversation with us because we're not on church staff. So there's no kind of awkwardness that goes with that conversation.
Wow, I think that would help a bunch of churches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So now you kind of already led into this a little bit, but I was thinking, man, if somebody has a bunch of money or a bunch of assets or a bunch of whatever, then they already have these advisors around them. And you said most of them don't? That's surprising to me.
Yes, and it actually was to me as well, because I just made that same assumption. But after being part of this team for, coming up on a year now, this is what I've seen time and time again. And I've actually talked to those people and they've said, oh yeah, my financial advisor understands a little bit about this conversation from, let's say, a tax perspective. How can I leverage charity to reduce taxes? And that's important. But most people who are generous already they're not necessarily motivated to be more generous just so they can save taxes. Now, that's a powerful motivator, okay? I'm not going to diminish that. But most of these people actually are seeing an opportunity to be more generous than they ever realized they could be. And that's not the conversation that their financial advisors are having with them. They're helping them think about it from the standpoint of preservation of capital so I can leave as much as possible for my heirs. Not necessarily, hey, how do I make the most impact possible with what God's entrusted to me? How do I do it in a way that doesn't ruin my kids? You wouldn't believe how often that conversation comes up because people are sensitive, people of means especially, like how much is too much? I don't want to spoil my kids. I don't want to ruin them. I want to set them up for success, but too much could actually be a negative thing. Again, there are CPAs and financial advisors are not having that level of conversation with them. So most of them are alone in that conversation. So when we bring that to the table, it's like a breath of fresh air for them that brings up things that they've just never even thought about before.
Well, Steve, when you and I first talked about the giving crowd a year or so ago, I can remember in my mind going, I'm not one of those guys. And then you challenged me on that. I don't know if you remember that conversation, maybe a little bit. And then we began to look at, our own personal situation, probably a lot like you, and went, oh, there's some things that we can do now to get prepared not only for the future,
yes,
but even helpful to causes that are really important to us right now. And so can you walk us through like a quick process of what that is for maybe a normal interaction?
Yeah. So if I understand what you're asking, I think you're saying, how do we spark the average American couple to start thinking about this?
Yeah,
not just the guy with a bunch of money.
Yeah. I don't think I'm one of these, but then when you stop and take a look, it's like, oh, I have a lot more assets than I thought I did.
Yeah, exactly. I think in a church context especially, this conversation has to emanate from one that's already going on in the context of stewardship or discipleship. Going back to what I said earlier about you've got all this content about how do I get out of debt? How do I put aside an emergency fund and save for the future? All that's awesome. So what we're saying is let's just dovetail that with some content about, okay, what if I'm one of those people that gets on the other side of the financial stress and I'm actually in financial stability or financial abundance? Now what do I do? Now what is my responsibility? And one of those responsibilities is to make sure that if something unexpected happens to you, that your family is cared for, that you're not creating a situation that creates stress for the kids, and that you're being purposeful with what God's given you. And so I think, like I described with the conversation that Tara and I had, where we just said, hey, we just need to update our will. We're going to create that ways to start elevating that conversation within the context of the other conversations that are happening in a church around stewardship so that people's minds can be opened up to, oh, I need to think about stewardship in that context as well. Now, what does that look like? For you, it might just be, we need to update our will. For others, it might be like an older couple, for instance, who they've got an IRA sitting there that they don't really need to live on because they've done well in terms of saving for retirement. They can change the beneficiary on that IRA to go to their church instead of going to the kids. And that's something they can do today. And now that the money that's coming out of the IRA every year can go to the church instead of to them because they don't need the money. So those are just some real practical ways that we can open up the dialogue to create current gifts as well as legacy gifts down the road.
Yeah, you mentioned that something unforeseen happening. That made me think about your absolutely wonderful resource that you have, this You Only Die Once course.
Right.
You call it Yodo.
Yes.
Yeah, not Yoda, but Yodo.
Yodo.
And so tell us about that just a little bit. And by the way, you might want to know this through your influence. Kathy and I, actually, this is going to sound so morbid, but a few months ago, actually, when we were back in our hometown, we bought our burial plots.
Oh, wow.
Do you know how happy our kids were? It blew us away.
Really?
It's one of the most important and fulfilling purchases I've ever made. Now, doesn't that sound stupid? It doesn't to you, but maybe to our listeners. And it was like, oh my goodness, we took the steps, made the progress, and actually, so the kids don't have to worry about that. They don't have to think about it. We went through different sequences with our own children, and they feel so much freedom in that. I had no idea that it would be so freeing, not only for me, but for my family as well. So this Yodo course tell us about that.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because what you've just shared is a story that we've actually heard multiple times from people who've gone through the Yodo course. And it sparks a lot of different action items. But one of the ones that we keep hearing stories about is what you just said, where they're bringing the kids into the conversation and explaining to the kids, here's what your mom and I have done to plan for the end of life. And there is this sense of freedom and relief that comes from the kids. And for the parents, I would imagine for you and Kathy, there was a sense of, oh, this feels really good for us to know that we've planned well so that we're not creating burden for our kids when they're gone, right?
Yeah, we brought the kids into the conversation. And honestly, to start with, we just thought, well, we'll just do the cheapest thing, cremation, throw us in an urn. I didn't really care.
Right.
My youngest daughter said absolutely not.
Wow.
Absolutely not. And we wouldn't have known that had we not had this conversation as a family. And then it was like, oh, okay, no problem. And then we had to decide, well, where are we going to be buried?
Yeah.
All of that, which we did. And then we bought the burial plots. But the thing that you're talking about right there, it releases our children of anxiety and angst in an emotional time frame, whether it happens suddenly and unexpectedly, or the passing is of old age or whatever it might be. So super helpful.
Well, and holy cow, why is the church silent in this conversation? And I'm talking the local church, Big C church, but for the most part, we are silent on this dialogue. And so most people they're not having these conversations. And so therefore it's a missed opportunity. That's the gap that we're trying to fill. And that's why we loved it at the Giving Crowd. When we looked at what we're trying to do to help people understand stewardship from a new perspective, well, part of stewardship is also, how do we steward our values? How do we pass our values to the next generation? Not just our valuables, but our values. And so when we found this You Only Die Once course, we were just so excited about it, because what happens for the people that go through it is it opens up this conversation about legacy in terms of passing my values to my kids. But it also opens up the dialogue of stewardship of the things that we've already talked about, which is the money, the valuables that we leave behind. How do we do that with intentionality too? It fits like a hand in a glove for us, and it helps us to come alongside the church again from a discipleship and a stewardship perspective, not a fundraising perspective. We're not trying to create a new way to raise money. We're creating a new way to serve the people in your church in a way that no one else is serving them.
Yeah, wow, this is super helpful. Well, that wraps it up for part one of the Giving Crowd and Steve Caton. So next week we'll hit part two, and I cannot wait for that. So we'll see you next week with Steve Caton from the Giving Crowd.